Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on coaching and like really getting into the nitty-gritty of what makes a good coach. And we've got some awesome interviews with this veteran coach who's worked at basically every level you can imagine: high school, club, college,
Even semi-pro, yeah.
semi-pro. Yeah, talk about range.
It's pretty amazing. And like you said, all those different levels, it gives him a really unique perspective on not just coaching, but also education and how those two things really, how they work together, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And like one thing that he really emphasizes throughout these interviews is that coaching, it's not just about winning.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
about so much more than that. And he actually tells this story that really kind of stopped me in my tracks when I first heard it. He had to tell one of his young athletes that his grandmother had passed away. And this was the only family that this kid had.
Oh, wow. That's heavy.
Yeah, really tough situation. And what's really interesting is that the school principal, who's actually a former coach himself, he insisted that the coaches be the ones to break the news. Like, not a counselor, not a social worker.
Yeah. Why do you think he felt that it should be the coaches?
I think it just speaks to the level of trust and connection that coaches can build with their players, right? It goes way beyond just the sport itself.
Totally, yeah. And it kind of makes you realize, like, as a coach, you're not just dealing with X's and O's. You're dealing with young people's lives, their emotions. Like, you're stepping into their world in a way.
It's a huge responsibility, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually ties in perfectly with something he talks about a lot, like his core belief as a coach. He says success as a coach isn't about winning games or championships. It's about the impact you have on your players' lives, beyond the field, beyond the court, wherever you are.
That's so true. I mean, think about it. Like the mentors who really shaped who you are today, the lessons that have stuck with you all these years later. Like, it's probably not about some specific skill they taught you, right? It's about something bigger, something more human.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, this coach has worked with all sorts of teams, different levels. So I'm curious, like, does that philosophy, does it play out differently in different contexts? Like, is it easier to imply that belief at, say, the high school level, where maybe the focus is more on development
Right.
versus like a high-pressure semi-pro environment?
That's a great question. And he actually talks about that tension quite a bit, like the tension between winning, right, and actual player development,
Yeah?
especially at the high school level. He says focusing on player growth that ultimately leads to wins. But it requires a lot of patience and understanding. You can't just impose like rigid rules. You have to really adapt to each player's individual needs.
Okay, that makes sense. So does he have any like specific examples of how he actually navigates that?
He does, yeah. He tells the story about a player who kept like trying these really risky one-on-one moves, and he would lose the ball like all the time, And I think a lot of coaches would get super frustrated with that and just bench the kid.
Right, right.
But this coach, he did something different.
What did he do?
Well, instead of blaming the player, he kind of stopped and he asked himself, hold on a second, have I even like given him the tools to succeed at this?
I love that. Like taking a step back and really reflecting on his own coaching.
Exactly. And I think that's such a powerful question for any coach or mentor to ask themselves.
Totally. Like it shifts the focus from pointing fingers to really taking responsibility for your player's development.
Right. So, instead of just yelling at the kid or benching him, he actually adapted his approach, right?
Uh-huh.
Focused on developing that player's skills in those specific areas where he was struggling. And eventually, the player started to get better. He was able to make those moves more effectively.
So it wasn't about just being nice or letting players do whatever they want. Like he still had high standards,
Right.
but he was willing to adapt his methods to really meet the needs of his players.
Totally.
And it makes me think of this quote that he mentions. It's from Anson Dorrance, who's like this legendary soccer coach.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he says, inspect what you expect, right?
Oh, I love that quote.
And the coach, he uses that to explain how he approaches training. Like he creates practice scenarios to really get the specific mental and emotional responses he wants to see in games.
Like he's kind of reverse engineering the practice environment.
Yeah, exactly.
So, for example, if he wants his players to like stay calm and composed under pressure, right?
Yeah.
He'll create those high pressure situations during practice. So when they're actually in the game, they've already been there. They've built that resilience.
It's like practicing for a big presentation or like a job interview. Like the more you can simulate that pressure beforehand, the more prepared you'll be when it actually matters.
Exactly.
And he gives another example. He'll sometimes make a bad call, like intentionally, during a footage, just to see how his players react.
Interesting, yeah.
So it's not just about physical skills, right? It's about developing their emotional intelligence, their mental toughness. Like he's really trying to shape them into well-rounded people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes you wonder, though, like how do you find that balance, right, as a coach between pushing your players and like creating a supportive environment where they can actually learn from those mistakes, especially when you have like team rules and expectations that you got to uphold.
Well, he talks about this one dilemma he had, and it really highlights that tension. He had this player, super talented, but he was always showing up late to practice.
Oh, that's tough. Every coach's, I guess, nightmare.
Yeah, and the rules, like the strict team rules, said he should be benched, right? But this coach, before jumping to punishment, he decided to dig a little deeper, and he found out that this player was working late nights to help support his family.
Oh, wow.
Like he was missing dinner a lot of times just to work and help out.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely puts things in a different light. It's like a good reminder that there's always more to the story, right, than what
Always.
you might see on the surface. So how did he handle it?
He does something interesting. He actually turns the question back on us. Like he asks, how would you handle it? Should rule always be absolute? Or is there room for understanding, for some flexibility?
That's a tough one. Because on the one hand, you need rules, right? You need rules to have structure. You need rules to be fair. But on the other hand, you're dealing with real people, right? With real lives. And sometimes, like, things happen.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this coach like so effective. He finds that balance. He doesn't just blindly enforce the rules. He holds his players to high standards, but he also creates that space for open communication, for understanding individual circumstances.
So in this case, like, how did it work out with that player?
They were able to find a solution together, something that worked for both the team and the player.
It's that empathy, right? Like being able to see the bigger picture.
Totally. And it actually reminds me of this other story he tells about a bullying incident on one of his teams. And one of the assistant coaches, he wanted to like strictly follow the club policy, which meant punishment, right? But this coach, he pushed back. He said, hold on. Let's try to understand what's really going on here. Like, why is this happening? How do both of these players, how do they feel?
So it's kind of like that restorative justice approach, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about focusing on repairing the harm that was caused and rebuilding relationships instead of just punishing the person who did something wrong. And it goes back to that we over me mentality that he's like always talking about. He wants to build that into his teams, like the program, the team, it's always more important than any one individual.
That's powerful. And that's something that, like, I mean, that goes way beyond sports, right? I mean, think about how often we encounter conflict at work, in our families, even just online. Like, what if we approached those situations with that same kind of like emphasis on understanding, on communication?
Right. And it all goes back to, the coach's his dedication to growth. Not just his players' growth, but his own. Remember that tattoo he got, learning never stops?
Oh, yeah. I love that.
And it's not just like a cool slogan for him. It's how he lives. He's always reading books about coaching, he's taking courses, he's always looking for new perspectives.
And what I find so interesting is that he doesn't just focus on like the wins, like the good coaching sessions. He's willing to learn from his mistakes, from the bad sessions, from the drills that completely flop.
Yeah. He's always asking himself, like, okay, that didn't work. How can I use this to improve? How can I make my approach better next time? Which, again, it's such a great question for all of us, right?
Totally, yeah. We all have those moments where we fall short, right?
Yeah.
Or things just don't go according to plan. But instead of getting discouraged, like, what if we saw them as opportunities to actually grow?
Exactly.
And he actually applies that growth mindset to his own well-being, too. Like, for the first 15 years of his coaching career, he was just like, go, 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 neglecting his own self-care completely.
Yeah, he was so focused on his players, on the demands of the job, that he totally burned himself out.
I think so many of us can relate to that, right? We get so caught up in the hustle and the grind that we forget to actually take care of ourselves.
Yeah, it was easy to do, but eventually he realized he couldn't keep going like that. Something had to change.
So what did he do?
He started carving out 1 hour every day, no matter what, for a walk and listening to podcasts. He said it's non-negotiable.
Wow. So he really prioritized his well-being. And it sounds like he turned it into a habit.
He did, and it just shows you that self-care isn't selfish, right? It's actually essential to being your best self in all areas of your life.
And it sends such a powerful message to his players, too, right?
Right, like he's modeling that behavior for them. He's showing them that it's okay to take care of yourself.
That's awesome. And speaking of perspectives, you know this coach? He's had all these experiences abroad, right?
Yeah, he just got back from a coaching course in Scotland,
Oh, cool.
and he was really struck by the differences between like coaching in the US versus coaching over there.
I'm curious, like what stood out to him?
Well, first of all, just the sheer size of the US. Like he even joked that driving across New Jersey can take longer than what some people in Scotland consider a long drive.
That's hilarious. I mean, I guess when you're used to a smaller country, right, the vastness of the U.S. can be a bit of a shock.
Totally. But beyond the size, he also talked about the diversity of coaching styles in the US. And he said it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, it can be frustrating because it's not like everybody's on the same page, right? Like he saw in Scotland, there's all these different approaches and philosophies, and it can be kind of like overwhelming.
Right.
But at the same time, he loved that variety because he says you're never going to get bored.
That's a great point. It keeps things fresh and challenging, right? Forces you to constantly learn and adapt.
Exact. And he seems to really thrive on that challenge. He talked about how, at the high school level, he's limited to the players who live in his city, right?
Right.
So he has to get creative. He has to adapt to the players he has each year and figure out how to make the best possible team with what he's got.
It's like a puzzle almost, right? You have all these different pieces, these unique individuals. You got to figure out how they fit together.
Yeah, and that's what he loves about coaching. It's not just about like the X's and O's. It's about understanding people, about building relationships, about creating that culture of growth and learning.
It's about seeing the potential in every player, right? And helping them reach it on and off the field. Yeah, it's really cool to hear about a coach like that, someone who's like really mastered both the technical side of coaching, but also like the human side of it too.
And what's amazing is that he's managed to keep that passion going, that dedication for over 20 years.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you wonder, how does he stay so energized and avoid burnout? Because it's a pretty demanding job, right?
Well, I mean, he had mentioned that it took him a while to figure that out. Like he spent the first 15 years of his career just completely ignoring his own well-being. He was so focused on his players, on all the demands of the job.
Yeah, like he was giving all the time, but not really taking care of himself.
Exactly.
And that's something I think we can all relate to, right? Whether you're a coach or a teacher or just anyone who's trying to like juggle all the demands of life. It's easy to forget about yourself.
For sure.
But he realized like he couldn't keep going like that.
Yeah.
Something had to change.
So what did he start doing?
He made this like conscious decision to start prioritizing his own well-being.
Okay.
So now he makes sure to carve out an hour every single day, no matter what, for a walk and listening to podcasts. He says it's non-negotiable.
That's awesome. So he really like put it in his schedule.
Yeah, he did. He made it a priority. And it really shows like that commitment to his own growth, to his own sustainability as a coach.
And I think it sends such a good message to his players too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like he's modeling that behavior, showing them that it's okay to take care of themselves, that it's not selfish.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think we could all learn from that, no matter what we do.
Totally. Like even if we can't take a full hour every day, just finding those little pockets of time to recharge and take care of ourselves, it makes a big difference.
Absolutely. It's essential, really.
So before we wrap things up, I wanted to touch on one last thing that the coach said that really stuck with me. He mentioned that he's never felt over-prepared for a game or a practice.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it made me think, like, how often do we feel underprepared, right? Whether it's for, like, a big presentation at work or a tough conversation we need to have or even just, like, our daily to-do list.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
What if we all kind of adopted that mindset? Like, what if we approached those situations with that same level of intentionality, like really thinking through all the possibilities, planning ahead as much as we can?
Right, like embracing that idea of over-preparing.
Exactly. I mean, imagine how that could impact our performance, our confidence.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I feel like we've learned so much from this coach, not just about soccer, but about teaching, about leadership, about life.
He's really given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, he's reminded us that it's not just about winning.
Right.
It's about growth, about connection, about constantly learning and trying to be better.
And about taking care of ourselves along the way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of coaching and beyond. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and some inspiration to take with you.
And remember, learning never stops.